It was 4:37 a.m. in a quiet Detroit neighborhood, the kind of hour when the world feels still, asleep. But that morning, a woman was found slumped over the steering wheel of her car, the engine still running. Her head was caved in, the violence so brutal she was unrecognizable. Her clothes were soaked, yet there hadn't been a single drop of rain. The car was parked somewhere she hadn't driven to. No explanation, no apparent motive, no signs of a struggle, no weapon, no fingerprints, no clue. Just a lifeless body left to rot in the early morning fog. To the authorities, it felt meaningless, another random act of violence. But in a twisted way, that was what made it so terrifying. Whoever killed this woman had no vendetta. They didn't need a reason. For months, the police were clueless. They had no leads. What they didn't know was that this wasn't an isolated case. This was the work of someone far more dangerous, more elusive than they could have imagined. This was the beginning of Carl Eugene Watts' reign of terror. A man who killed women not out of hatred, but because he believed they needed to be erased from the world. Carl Watts was born in Texas in 1953. His early life outwardly seemed almost normal, opposite to what you'd expect from a monster. He was quiet, introverted, the kind of child who could simply go unnoticed. But when Carl was just 8 years old, something happened that would forever change him. He contracted viral meningitis. The illness left him with lingering effects, and those around him started to notice subtle shifts in his behavior. Where he had once been shy, he became distant, cold, detached. His social interactions grew minimal, and then he started drawing disturbing images. Images that foreshadowed the darkness inside him. As Carl entered his teenage years, his disturbing behavior grew more pronounced. He began to experience vivid nightmares. But these weren't just random fantasies. These were violent fantasies where he stalked and killed women. And to Carl, these weren't just dreams. They were detailed, vivid, and in his mind, absolutely real. He would describe these killings with a terrifying level of calmness, even satisfaction. He spoke of the peace, of the control he felt after each act of violence. But Carl didn't just dream about it, he planned it. When he was just 15 years old, Carl attacked a woman for the first time. He didn't know her. She was a random target, a woman he ambushed, attacked, and stabbed. She survived the attack, but Carl was arrested. The psychiatric evaluation that followed painted a chilling portrait of his psyche. He was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, and the doctors warned unequivocally that he posed a severe risk of future violence. But this wasn't enough to stop him. He spent only 2 months in a psychiatric facility before being released. He wasn't stopped. He was merely given a taste of freedom, and he wouldn't waste it. Carl slipped back into society, blending in like an invisible predator. He kept a low profile, living a life that appeared normal on the outside. He enrolled in school, worked odd jobs, even played football. People genuinely believed Carl had grown out of the darkness that had once lived inside him. But inside, the monster was waiting. And by the time he was 20, the urges were simply too strong to ignore. Carl didn't need a motive. His victims didn't need to be connected to him in any personal way. He didn't choose them based on race, age, or appearance. He didn't care about their backgrounds or their lives. His victims were simply women. Women who, in Carl's twisted mind, represented something evil. He believed that they were all flawed, that something inside them needed to be erased. He didn't know them, but to him, they were all the same, unworthy of life. His killing spree began slowly, but with each murder, Carl grew bolder. He targeted women who were alone, often those in isolated or unprotected areas. He struck with brutal force, killing swiftly, without hesitation. There was no need to celebrate his actions afterwards. He didn't leave behind trophies or take joy in the aftermath. Once he had taken a life, he simply moved on, like nothing had happened, like he had done his job and it was time to disappear again. As Carl's reign of terror continued, the authorities were still clueless. They had no idea they were dealing with a serial killer. They saw isolated incidents, random acts of violence, and could never connect them. Carl's ability to blend in, to remain invisible, was what made him so dangerous. He was a killer who wasn't trying to get caught. He didn't want fame. He didn't want recognition. He simply wanted to kill, and he would continue to do so for years. In 1974, Carl Eugene Watts moved to Detroit, and right after he arrived, women started dying. The first was strangled in her apartment, the next drowned in her bathtub, the third beaten with a pipe and dumped like trash in a back alley. Different methods, different neighborhoods, different victims, no connections, no suspects, just silence and corpses. And that was the point, because Carl didn't want to get caught. He didn't want attention. He didn't even want to be remembered. He wanted the opposite. He wanted to erase, to eliminate. He believed certain women were evil, not because they'd done anything, but because he felt it. That was all he needed, his gut. And once Carl locked onto that feeling, it didn't matter who you were already dead. What made Carl terrifying wasn't just what he did, it was how he did it. No pattern, no motive, no connection to the victims. He didn't stalk them for weeks. He didn't lure them in. He didn't play mind games. He killed quickly, cleanly, with purpose, and he never used the same method twice. It made him invisible. There was no signature, no calling card, nothing to link one scene to the next. Detroit police didn't stand a chance. The city was drowning in violent crime, shootings, robberies, gang wars, drugs. Every day brought another murder, another assault, another body. And in that chaos, Carl thrived. He slipped between the cracks like smoke. Every time they found one of his victims, it looked random. A robbery gone wrong, a domestic dispute, just another statistic. And by the time the cops even started the paperwork, Carl was already gone. He picked his victims carefully. Women who were alone, isolated, the kind of people no one looked out for. Some were students, some were elderly, some were barely scraping by. He didn't care once he saw them, once he decided they were broken, twisted, unclean. He acted. Strangulation, blunt force, drowning, stabbing, each one different, each one untraceable, and he didn't stop. Over the next 6 years, the murders kept coming, silent, cold, ruthless. Some happened in the middle of the night, some in broad daylight. There was no rhythm to catch, no pattern to follow. The only consistency was this: the victims didn't survive. And Carl didn't leave a trace. He didn't kill for lust or trophies. He didn't get high off power. He didn't want control. He just wanted them gone. By 1981, Carl had murdered so many women in Detroit that even he started to feel the pressure. The city was getting smaller. He needed space, new streets, new shadows to disappear into. So he moved to Houston, Texas, a bigger city, more chaos, more noise to hide in. And within weeks, the killing started again. But this time, something changed. Carl fell into a rhythm, a dark routine. Most of his new attacks happened early Sunday mornings. Women alone in their apartments, preparing for church, drinking coffee, getting ready to start the day. That's when Carl moved. He became the shadow outside your window, the knock on your door when you weren't expecting anyone. Sometimes he found an unlocked entrance. Other times he asked to borrow something. He didn't look dangerous. He didn't act crazy. But the moment he stepped inside, the door closed. And death followed. He attacked with terrifying speed. There was no build-up, no speech, no hesitation. It was like flipping a switch. 1 second he was calm, the next he was tearing someone apart. And when it was over, he walked out as quietly as he came in. No one ever saw him leave. The media started calling him the Sunday morning slasher. But the police still had no idea who he was. The attacks were still too different, the victims too spread out. Houston was massive. Without physical evidence, they were nowhere close. Then Carl made a mistake. May 23rd, 1982, he targeted 2 young women, Melinda Aguila and Lori Listister. He forced his way into their apartment, tied them up, and began to drown Lori in the bathtub. But Melinda was still alive. And she wasn't staying tied down. She broke free, sprang to the balcony, and jumped from the 2nd floor, shattered bones, bloodied feet, but she ran, screaming, barefoot across the pavement. She found a neighbor, called 911. When the cops arrived, Carl was already walking out of the complex, calm, no panic, no sign of guilt. And when they stopped him, he looked at them and said, "I'm the one you're looking for. I've done this before." Carl Watts was in custody, and then he started talking. He confessed. Murder after murder, names, locations, all details that hadn't been released to the public. Investigators were stunned. They realized he wasn't just a local killer. This was a serial murderer on a national scale. They suspected him of over 80 murders between Texas and Michigan alone. Some even believed the real number was higher, much higher. But there was a problem. Carl was smart, careful. He never left forensic evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, and prosecutors were terrified they wouldn't be able to convict him of any of the homicides. So they made the deal. Carl confessed to dozens of murders, and in exchange, he got immunity for all of them. He was only charged with burglary and attempted murder and sentenced to 60 years in prison. But there was a catch. Under Texas law, Carl's crime was considered nonviolent because there had been no sexual assault or robbery involved. This meant that Carl's sentence was lighter than it should have been. Even worse, he could be eligible for parole in as little as 5 years. The public was outraged. Families of the victims, along with the general public, were horrified that a man with a body count that stretched into the dozens could be set free so easily. Carl's future remained uncertain, and his past still haunted the families of his victims. However, Carl's fate was far from sealed. Michigan had been keeping track of his case, and they were ready to act. Detectives began re-examining cold cases, unsolved murders that fit the timeline of Carl's known killings. One case in particular caught their attention, the 1979 murder of Helen Ducher. She had been stabbed to death. A witness had seen the attack, but the investigation had never followed up on the tip. In 2004, after years of silence, the witness identified Carl Watts in a police lineup. With this new lead, Michigan authorities charged Carl with first-degree murder. In 2004, Carl was extradited from Texas to Michigan. His trial would be the beginning of the end. Carl was convicted of Helen Ducher's murder and sentenced to life in prison. But the investigation didn't stop there. Michigan authorities linked him to over 100 murders, many of which had previously been dismissed as accidents or unsolved cases. But Carl remained silent. He refused to speak, offering no remorse, no explanations for his actions. His reign of terror had finally ended, but the victims whose lives he had taken were left with no closure. In September 2007, Carl Eugene Watts died of prostate cancer in prison. His death was met with little fanfare. To many, it seemed like a fitting end for a man who had evaded justice for so long. Carl never fully confessed to all of his crimes. He never showed remorse for the lives he had stolen. The victims, whose names remained unknown, would never find justice or closure. His story was one of chilling anonymity, a killer who struck without reason, without recognition, and without care. In the end, Carl Watts had slipped through the cracks of justice, and it would remain that way forever. The ghost of Carl Watts reminds us how truly terrifying it is when evil hides in plain sight. What do you think allowed him to operate for so long, and how do you feel about the immunity deal that almost set him free? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this story gripping, please hit that like button and subscribe for more true crime you won't forget.